The WordPress ecosystem is a bit of a mess right now. So, if you're looking for a new WordPress alternative to build a blog, or maybe you're just looking for a solid open source content platform that goes above and beyond what WordPress can actually do, I think I have a pretty good solution. So, we're going to see how we can build a new blog in Next.js using Directus. Directus is a content and data platform that goes beyond the headless CMS. And while we're going to use it for building a blog, we're really going to be able to see how powerful the platform is, where you can really customize the options and have a lot of flexibility for how you use it inside of your projects. And on top of being a powerful backend, it's open source. So we're going to see how easy it is to self-host this and ship something fast. Directus was kind enough to sponsor this video, so let's see how quickly we can dig in. Now, getting started, the first thing that we need is a new instance of Directus. One way that we can do that is to install it locally. So if you have Docker installed, or maybe you want to install it yourself, you can simply drop in a new Docker Compose file. You can run Docker Compose up, and it's automatically going to spin everything up for you. It's really easy to do locally. But another easy solution where we ultimately want to have this deployed somewhere so that we can use it as a headless CMS, of course, when we're deploying our front end, we can use Railway, which includes a template that'll make it even easier to deploy this. Now, this video isn't sponsored by Railway. I just found this to be a really easy way to spin up a new instance of Directus. So once you create your new Railway account, or even if you want to use Docker and spin this up somewhere else, I'm going to head over to the dashboard of Railway, and we can see that we even get a $5 credit, which I used just a tiny bit of it as I was spinning up a separate demo to see how this works. Now, once you're ready and want to create that new Railway application, we're going to go ahead and create a new one. We're going to select Deploy a Template, where then we can search for Directus. And we can see that we have a few open source options here, where the specific one that I'm going to choose is going to be the Directus option, which looks like it's coming from Carlos Medim. Now we can see that this is going to use two services. The first one's going to be Directus itself, and then it's also going to use a Postgres database. Now here we can see that we need to configure one variable. If we click configure here, we can see that all this is going to be the admin email address that we'll use in order to log in. So I'm going to put hello, if I spell it, at colbyfayok.com. And if you want, you can even go through all the different variables. You can set the secret key if you'd like. We can even set up the password if we want, but I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to click save config and then finally deploy. Now from here, Railway is going to set up and spin up this new environment for us. And we can see right in the side is starting to actually work and deploy those. As it's working through this, we're going to see all the activity in our little sidebar here, so we know exactly what's going on and how long it's taking to do everything. Now, as easy as Railway is, if you want something that just works and you don't have to deal with all the pipeline stuff, you can check out Directus's own cloud solution. Now, once it's ready though, it took less than a minute for me to actually spin this up. I can select into it and we can see that we have a deployment address, where if I now open that up, we can see that I now have the ability to log into my new admin. Now, of course, we'll need a password for this. So you can either probably go through the forgot password flow, or alternatively, if you want to use the password that's already set to maybe just log in and then change it, you can head over to the Railway app, where if we go to variables, we can see that we have the option to view all the different variables that were used, where we can see I have this admin password. I'm going to just simply click copy rather than showing it. I'm going to head back over to Directus, hello at colbyfayok.com, and we can see that I already have one of those Railway apps set up. But now if I log into this one and click sign in, we can see that we were immediately dropped into our new Directus dashboard. And how long did it take? A minute or two? It was really quick to get everything up and running. Now, as far as Railway goes, we don't really need to manage anything else for now there. We don't need to do anything else to quick start. We have our Directus instance. Now we can just start building our content. So I set up a basic starting point that's loosely based off of the WordPress 2024 theme. We can see our migration from WordPress here, where now I'm going to start to fill out the content of this homepage. And really what I want to do is I want to make all this dynamic. I want to be able to set up these services, some kind of quote, all my dynamic posts. I really want to start to fill out this site with all of my data. Now, if you want to skip ahead, I have the complete project available as a starter template that you can find in the description below. Now, as far as the code goes, it's a pretty standard Next.js application. I'm using Tailwind, TypeScript, ShadCN, the usuals. We can see it in my homepage here that it's really just a bunch of static content right now. But we can see things like the title here, the subtitle here, the buttons that we want to have for that header. We want to be able to have a dynamic cover page, or cover image rather, and all this different content. We want to be able to fill this in dynamically from our content data source. Okay, so I know this is a blog, but let's start off with the homepage, because that's the first page that we have and it's actually available here, where we have a few things that we want to do. Let's create a new hero, where we have our hero title, we have our hero subtitle, we have a hero cover image, and we saw in those links there, I want to add a little button so that we can click to go somewhere, whether that's maybe the newest post or a services page, or that's really what you want to make of it. So when we were dropped into our Directus dashboard, we have this new option to create a collection. Now, the way that this is basically going to work is we're going to create schemas that is going to represent the content that we want to store. Now, you can either just click create collection here, or as we'll see later, the way that we're going to create new schemas is going to the settings page where we're going to go under the data model section, which is where we're going to go ahead and create our new collections over time. We're here, how about we just add home? And because this home page is going to be just a singular page, we're going to manage our other pages in a different way later. But for our basic home page, we're going to select singleton. We're going to treat this as a single object because it's really only going to be one piece of content that represents our homepage. But then we can go ahead and just click the next button. We can add any optional fields that we want. And for the homepage, it probably doesn't matter too much of these. We'll see what some of these other fields mean as we work through the other content. So for now, I'm just going to go ahead and click finish setup. Now, thinking again about the different content that we want to add, the first thing that we want to do is add all that hero content. So I'm going to go ahead and click create field, where for our title, let's go ahead and select an input where we can add hero underscore title, because we want to make sure that that's the title specific to the hero. Now, when we look at this type field, we can add a couple different ways of how we express this. But for now, I just want it to be a string because it's going to be a simple sentence. Now, after we have that, you can either require it or not. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down and just simply hit save. Now, of course, we want to have our subtitle as well. So I'm going to do the same thing, hero subtitle. I'm going to leave that as a string. Then I'm going to scroll down, hit save on that. But next, we want to think about how we want to express those buttons. Now, if we click create field again, there's another field called a repeater. Now, if we select this, this is going to be a way to express multiple different pieces in a single group. So let's call this hero buttons, where we can start to scroll down and see what different available options we have, including this edit fields section, which is going to be where we define the different fields as part of that repeater of the different items that we can actually add. So let's click create new for this. We can add something like label, which is going to be the label or what the button actually shows. We can define a couple different options here. We want to make sure that we select the type, make this a string as well. I'm going to go ahead and select save. And then we want to add a second one. We can make this link. So this is going to be the href that we select. We can make this a string as well, and then hit save. And then ultimately hit save on our hero buttons. Now, finally, we want to be able to add our image. So again, we're going to click create field, and we can scroll down, or we can go ahead and search for image, where once we find our image, we can call this hero cover, or really whatever you want to name that. We can scroll down and have a few options as well. I'm going to go ahead and click save. Now, at this point, Directus is going to automatically save all those changes that we made to the schema. Of course, if you want, you can hit this save if you have that available, but I don't have this since it did automatically save. We can see that we can even delete it if we want, or if we need to start from scratch, or really whatever, but we don't want to do that right now. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to head back over to the content section, which is this little box here, where we now have this home option, and we can see that because that's the only content that we have available, it's automatically going to navigate to that. But now what we can do is we can fill out all of our details for this homepage. Now, with the help of Claude, I added a little bit of text here for the title and subtitle. It's just simple text that we're going to use inside of the app. But if we go to our hero buttons, remember, this is the unique repeater button that we add, where if we click create new, we now have the ability to add different strings for where we want and what this button should show. So we can add something like what's new, or really whatever you want that button to say. I'm going to add a link of posts, which isn't going to exist to start, but later we'll create an all post link. I'm going to hit save. And we can see we now have that hero button. And again, because this is a repeater, we can add as many buttons as we want, realistically, for how many we actually want to show in that hero button. But then finally, to wrap up our hero section here, we can go down to our hero cover or our image. I can click to browse. And how about we select this picture of a galaxy, or really whatever you have. I have that inside of the public directory of the template if you're using that, but we can see that we now easily added that to our field. Now, unlike the schema, we are going to need to make sure that we click save here so that we do save those changes and don't lose them. But as we're doing this, one interesting thing that you might notice is at the top right, we get this little icon here because we now have a new revision. Now, maybe if you're coming from the WordPress area, one thing that you love about WordPress is that it gives you those revisions. So we also have that in Directus. But now we have our first piece of content. Let's actually start to dynamically pull this into the app so that as we're working through, we can continue to add things little by little. So to do that, the first thing that we're going to want to do is install the Directus SDK. We can see that it's as simple as just running npm install Directus SDK. So in my terminal, I'm going to go ahead and run npm install Directus SDK. And back inside the documentation, we can see that the basic usage is starting to create this new client, which we're going to use to query for our data. Now, if we scroll down just a little bit, we have this section creating a composable client, which is how we're going to set up our interface that we're going to use to query for our data. Now, we have two options here. We can either use the REST API or we can use the GraphQL API. Now, for this walkthrough, we're going to use the REST API, but there's no reason you couldn't use the GraphQL if you prefer that syntax. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy the top of this block. And back inside of my code, I already have a new directory called lib where I already have some utils. What I'm going to do is inside of the lib directory, inside of the source directory, I'm going to create a new file called directus.ts, where inside I'm going to paste in that code. We can see that we have this GraphQL that we can get rid of, and I'm going to rename this client, which I'm first going to export to Directus. So we now have our Directus client that we're going to use to export. Now, if we just go ahead and kind of look through this quick, we can see that what it's essentially doing is it's creating a new instance of Directus where we're going to be able to pass in our endpoint, where then it's going to specify that we want to use the REST API. Now, as far as that API endpoint goes, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new environment variable that stores this value. Because of course, if we have different instances of Directus, or maybe just simply we want to make sure that we have that same value available everywhere, we want to be able to use that in a flexible way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file in the root of my project and call that .env.local. I'm going to call this Directus API endpoint. And that endpoint is going to be where our railway app is located or where our dashboard is located. Now, what I mean by that is if we go to our Directus instance, we can see that we have this base path, which is going to be where our Directus instance is located. And that's what we're going to use for the environment variable. So if I copy that, I can go ahead and paste that in as my environment variable. And then back inside of my Directus file, I'm going to replace this with process .env.directus API endpoint. Now, as we can see, we're getting a TypeScript error because this is expecting a string, and unless you have your type safe environment variables set up, I'm just going to simply wrap this as a string. But now that we have this set up, we can start to query our data, where the first thing we want to do is get that home data. Now, the way that I like to set things up is I like to create a new lib file for each of the different schemas that I have, where, for instance, inside of the lib directory, I'm going to create a new home.ts file, which is where I'm going to query all the data related to the homepage, where the first thing that I want to do is I want to just get that data. Now, heading back to the documentation for a second, the way that we're going to actually query for this data is we're going to use this read item function that we're going to import from the SDK. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to use that client that we created. We're going to use the request method, and then we're going to pass in that read item function along with the IDs of the data that we want to get. So inside of the code, let's export a new async function called getHome, where inside we're going to make that request. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to import our Directus client from libdirectus. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide my sidebar here, but I'm going to return directus.request, where we're going to use the read items, the items function actually, where we're going to then pass in the ID of what we want to get. And our schema is called home, so we're going to pass in home. Now, of course, we need to make sure we import the Directus SDK here. But now if we head back to our home page, let's start by importing get home from lib home, where we can now run const data is equal to await get home. Where one thing to point out here is because I'm working out of a server component, I can make this top level request inside the component itself since we're using that data on the server. So we can see here that I have it already designated as an async function for this server component. But we can see that now that I have this data, let's go ahead and try to console log this out just to see if it's working. And if we refresh the page, it looks like we actually ran into an error. So let's head over to the console, and it looks like if we scroll up here, it's forbidden. Now, by default, the data is not going to be readily available. We need to actually give it permission to read from any public location. So if we head back over to Directus and we go down to the settings tab and we go down to access policies, we're going to head over to the public section where underneath permissions, we're going to now add a new collection or that schema to have public permissions. So under this add collection button, let's go ahead and select home, where here we can see that we can give permission for all these different access roles, or rather these actions. So I want to go ahead and select read and then select all access because we want to make it publicly accessible. And then at the top, I'm going to go ahead and click save. Now this time, if we try to refresh the page, we can see that we do now load the page. If we head to our terminal and scroll all the way down, we can see that we now have all of our hero data. So now we can start to dump this in our page, where if I scroll down with our title, I'm going to make this data hero title. Similarly, for the subtitle, it's going to be hero subtitle. And while I know that we see the squiggly lines there, let's wait a second where if I go back to my page now, we can see that we now have that title and the subtitle, and it was that easy to get into our page. Now let's address these TypeScript errors where we want to make sure that we're able to define the schema for our actual data. Now, the way that we're going to do this is we're going to create a new interface and we're going to call that home, where we're going to start to define all of our data points, where we have our title, or rather our hero title, which is going to be a string. We also have our hero subtitle. And then what we're going to do is, because that it's going to be defining the actual Directus schemas for this for TypeScript, we're going to overwrite it. So I'm going to say that I want to define this as unknown to first allow me to overwrite this, and then specify as home. But as soon as we set that up, we can see that now on our page that we don't have any more of those TypeScript errors. Now we want to make sure that we also define all the other fields that we expect. So if we head back to the terminal for a second, we can see that we have our hero buttons, which is going to be an array of objects that includes our label and our link. And then we have our hero cover, which is currently looking like a string. So let's add these all. I'm going to first add that cover, which is currently a string. And then we're going to add our hero buttons, which is going to be an array of objects, which is going to include our link, which will be a string, and our label, ABC order, which is also a string. Now I'm defining these as optional because, as we'll see later, you can select what fields that you want to get from all your data requests. So maybe you want to query your homepage data in some other random place that you don't actually want to include all the fields. You maybe only want to include one field, but then you're going to get a TypeScript error if you don't have all the rest of it. So that's why I'm defining these as optional. But let's start to add the rest of our data here, where we're going to wrap this unordered list. We're going to say array is array data hero buttons. Can't really type. And if it is an array, we want to make sure that we're going to pass in our unordered list. Going to indent this properly, and then we're going to set up our map statement. So we can say data hero buttons map, and for each button, we're going to ultimately return one of our list items. Make sure I indent this properly, where then we can start using that dynamic data, where how about for our key, because React is going to need that key, we can say button.label. That's probably good enough. We can add the actual label to the element itself. And we can see that we have this button here, and I currently have it set up as child, because what we're going to do is we're going to use the Next.js link component, because we want to make sure that we can take advantage of that client-side routing or just simply any kind of link. So I'm going to add the href here, and we're going to specify button.link. But what we're going to do with the as child is so that it applies any of the styles from the button component. In particular, this is shadcn. It's going to apply them down to the link. Now, what I'm going to also do is import this from next link. And we can see that because we are defining our link as optional, which we could probably just fairly define these as required. So if you do have any hero buttons, it's going to give you back the data because we want to make sure that we have both of those things. So we could probably safely say those are required, and that'll resolve that TypeScript error. Alternatively, you can add some kind of logic here to make sure that you have the link, or add some kind of fallback. But heading to the application, we can see that we do have that what's new link. It currently links to posts, which doesn't exist yet, but we'll see later how we can add that. Now, finally, we want to make sure that we update our image to actually point to the image inside of Directus. Now, if we head to the documentation, the way that we're going to set this up, if we go down to accessing a file, it's going to be our base API endpoint /assets, and then that file ID, which we saw as a string. So let's first make sure that we have our data.hero cover. And if we do have our hero cover, we're going to move up this image tag. Let me move this inside, and we can now specify for our href that that's going to be our process.env. Our, what is that environment variable name? The Directus API endpoint. We're going to want to make this a dynamic value. So I'm going to go ahead and add my template literal tags here. And then I'm going to make sure that this is going to be /assets, where then we can add in our data.hero cover. So we're getting our base, our host name for the asset, then we have /assets, and then we have our file ID. Now, if we open up the application, we can see that we do immediately get an error because we're trying to use the Next.js image component, which is trying to get a remote file, but we can see that it's tripping up because we need to configure it to be an allowable remote host to actually get this from. Now, if you click on the area here, you can see the pattern for how we actually need to set it up. We're going to add this to our next config file, where we're going to specify our images with this remote pattern. So back inside the project, if I open up my nextconfig.js file, I'm going to paste in the images remote patterns. I'm going to go ahead and replace this host name with process.env.directus API endpoint. And because I want this to actually be a dynamic value, I'm going to go ahead and now replace the https:// with nothing, because if we look at the env file, it includes this https, but for the remote patterns, Next.js only wants the host name and then the protocol separately specified. Now, because this is always going to be an https, at least for when we're hitting our Directus API endpoint to a remote address, we can leave this as static https, but we do want to make sure that this is only specifying a host name. We can get rid of the port, we can get rid of the path name. And one thing that I forgot to do is actually remove the trailing slash on the Directus API endpoint. We want to make sure that this does not include a trailing slash. But once that's properly set up and we try to refresh the page, we actually have another error. And if we open up our console here, we can see that we're getting another 403. Now, heading back to the Directus dashboard, not only do we need to make sure that our API endpoints are accessible, we need to make sure that our files are accessible. Now, this is going to be really how you want to set up the permissions, but they're not going to just automatically make all files public. That would be a pretty big security hole. So what we want to do now is make sure that we do make those files accessible. So I'm going to go into public. I'm going to go to add collection. And if we start to scroll down, we can see that we have a lot of different options. And the one that we want to select is Directus files. And of course, we want to also make this read in all access and then finally save. Now, again, you can get into pretty granular permissions for this, but I'm not going to cover that in the scope of this particular tutorial. But let's give this a try and reload the page again. And we can see that it loaded in now using the image component. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is we never actually set a real width and height. We're just setting a static value. The way that we're currently querying for our information is we're only getting that file ID. So how do we get the rest of that data? Whenever we make this request using read items, we can actually set a second parameter in here where we can specify fields as an array, which we can specify all the different fields that we actually want to return on the request. Now, as we already know, we can get our hero title, we can get our hero subtitle, we can get our hero buttons, we can get our hero cover, and that's not really going to change anything. But what's interesting is let's try it with hero cover. If we specify a period and then star, what we're going to say is we want to get all the fields related to our hero cover. And if we refresh the page here, we can see that our image broke. But if we look inside of the terminal, we'll see that we now have a ton more information, including the ID, which is what we'll use to construct that URL. But now we also have access to that width and that height, which we'll use for the sizing, and also some other metadata we need or we could use inside of the app. But now we want to actually update our type, where we're going to get an object, which is going to have a width, which will be a number. We're going to have our height. And we're also going to have our ID, which will be a string. Now, when we're making this request, we want to make sure we only get the fields that we need. So we can go down to our hero cover and we can update that to our width, our height, and our ID. Now, it's important to note that this pattern of selecting subfields is going to work for any of the different fields that have more metadata associated with them. So later, when we're creating a post, if we only want to grab the post title, we can specify as post.title. So here we're grabbing all the data that we need, and then we're only grabbing the select fields from the hero cover. But now, because we need to make sure that this is going to actually be an object, not just a string, we're going to say type of hero data cover equals object, but then we can start to use all those different data points where we have our width, we have our height, and then we can make sure that we also update the actual ID in the URL. But if we head back to the page, we can see that we do now get that image. And importantly, if we actually look at the image, even though we're cropping it with CSS, we can see that we are actually getting the real values, which just happens to be the same values that we had before. But these are now coming in dynamically, which is important, especially if we're rendering them at size to avoid content layout shift. So now as far as the homepage goes, the only thing left to do is start to fill out the rest of the content. So we have our services, including a title, a subtitle. We have all the services, which that looks like it could probably be a repeater. We have our quote. We have our posts, which we'll get to later. So for now, we want to get rid, or we want to add the quote and we want to add the services. Now, for the sake of time, I went ahead and added all these in. We can see I have my services title, subtitle, and list, where that list is a repeater that includes a title and description for each of them. We can see that I added my quote text, a quote name, and a quote position, which are all just simple strings. I even actually went through the data and I added some more text with the help of Claude. We can see that I have a services title, a subtitle. We have a services list, which includes a name and description for each of the different services. We have the quote text, which includes the text and name, such as Cosmo the space jellyfish, and as well as the position of the person or the space jellyfish. Now, this isn't going to look any different than it did before. We just need to make sure we define our data points. So I went ahead and defined all those types. And then importantly, I wanted to make sure that I define them all as fields so I can actually get the data associated with them. But one optimization that we can make here is because we always know we want to get all the data for the homepage because that's the only reason that we're going to add it for that particular field. It's not like we're going to reuse that homepage data anywhere else. We can just simply get rid of all these fields that we're manually defining except the hero cover. And we're just going to simply say star, where what we're going to say is we want to get all the fields, but for the hero cover specifically, we want to get some more granular data. Now, one thing to be clear is that's not usually recommended from a performance perspective because you really want to optimize the fields that you're actually going to get. But because we're literally just grabbing everything for the homepage, that's the only reason we'll define it. It's a good use case here. But if we want to use it for posts, for example, we want to make sure that we limit only the data that we need for each of those particular requests for the actual locations that we're using that data. But just like the title at the top of the page and the hero, I went ahead and added all the services. I'm looping through the services list, including the title description. I added all the quote information. And now we can see that I have my new development practice set up and I even have a super special quote from Cosmo. Now, arguably, one of the most important things here is the post. So let's get that set up. So back inside of my data model page in the settings, I'm going to go ahead and create a new schema file. I'm going to call this post. Now, previously for our homepage, we created this and treated it as a single object. But for us, for the posts, we want to make sure that we have a list of posts, not just a single object. So we're going to leave this unchecked. Another interesting thing here is because we want to use slugs as the identifier so that we can have post/slug as opposed to post/ID, we're going to rename this key field, primary key field, as slug, and we're going to specify it as a manually entered string. And then we're going to hit next. We're going to go through these optional fields, which because we're creating a post, we might want some more important information, such as when it was created, who it was created by, or when, to make sure that we have all those important data points. And then finally, we can click finish setup. Now, whenever we create these new models, we're ultimately going to be doing similar things for each and every one of them, where we're going to create the fields that we want to input into, and we're going to want to create the type of field. Now, this isn't usually going to be pretty unique. For the post, for instance, we're going to want to have a title. We're going to want to have a body, which we're going to write in, and that's probably going to be the most unique thing. So I'm going to go ahead and create my new title to start. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then if I click create field again, one thing that we can do is instead of the text input, which we've been using, we can maybe use the block editor, or we can even use the WYSIWYG editor, which is more like a rich text editor, or even Markdown. But I want to use the block editor for this. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. We can call this body, and then I'm going to hit save. So now that we have our model, we can start to add some post data. So if I head over to my content and I actually go to post this time, we can create a new item. And let's just say hello world for our first post, hello comma world for the title, and I'm writing my first post, exclamation point. And we can see that because we're using this block editor, we can have this really nice rich experience, kind of like we'd expect out of some of the other CMSs that we might have used like WordPress, where we can now use the slash commands where we're actually writing our code, where we're writing our text rather. But what we can see now for this purpose, I'm just adding my first post. So I'm gonna go ahead and click save. And another nice thing about Directus is we actually have some customization options here where I don't like the way that this is ordered by default. We can see that this is ABC order. So how about I just simply drag my title over, I drag my slug over because that's the most important thing for me. And I can even save this if I'm working with a team. I can create a bookmark for how that's actually saved. But as you might imagine, the next thing that's important for this is actually getting that content into our page. Now to start, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add these posts onto my homepage. And as you can imagine, this process is going to be pretty much exactly the same as what we did with our homepage. So I'm going to actually clone this one to start. So we're going to duplicate this home file. I'm going to call this posts, where now that we have a post file, we want to go ahead and change the schema to a post. We're going to get rid of all the types inside of that post. We're going to get rid of all the fields. I'm going to go ahead and now call this get posts instead of just get home. We're going to now read the post schema or model that we represented, and we're going to make sure we update this interface to post as well. But now we can start to fill out the actual post information, such as the title, which is going to be the primary thing, which is going to be a string. Now, because we're now accessing the post, I like to have a little bit more flexibility for the actual options that we pass in. Now, before we hard coded all of our fields into our get home function because really we're really going to use that get home function in one place on the home page, but the posts can be used anywhere. So I want to have a little bit more granularity for what I request and where for when I grab all the posts. So what I'm going to do is instead of passing these fields in directly, I'm going to replace this with an options variable, which I'm going to pass in as my argument. Now, of course, we're going to need a way to type this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a new shared type so that we can use this wherever we set up similar options. So over in the Directus file, I'm going to export a new interface called item query. or rather, let's make this items query, where the first one that we're going to set up is going to be our fields, which is going to be an array of strings. Now, technically you can pass in more string. Technically you can pass in more than just a string. There's a different object like syntax, but we're just going to use the array of strings for this. The Directus SDK also provides some types that can be a little bit more advanced. So if you want to check those out, you can head over to the Directus documentation. But because we're really just adding a simple thing, I'm just going to write those out manually for now. But now I'm going to also import that items query from the libdirectus and type out the options. And rather make sure that I import that as a type. Now, if you remember from before, the only other thing that we need to do is make sure that we make those posts publicly accessible, because we're going to need to do that for every model that we create. So I'm going to head over to the settings, to the access policies under public, and I'm going to add my new collection of posts. I'm going to add read, all access, and then click save. So now on my homepage, which is where I want to query all those posts because I want to add like a new what's new section, I'm going to import my get posts from the posts. I'm just going to move this next link up to the top here. We can add our new get posts function. We can get our featured posts rather. And then of course we want to pass in the options because we want to be able to have a way to filter this. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the fields and we're going to pass an array where all we want to do is we want to grab the title and we want to grab the slug. So as usual, let's go ahead and console log this out to make sure that it's working as expected. And if we look in the terminal, we can see that we have our featured posts, including our one hello world. Now, before we actually show this on the page, I just added a little bit more content here just so that we can have something a little bit extra to look at. And now at this point, it's really just working through that data just like anything else. So down where I'm actually creating that unordered list of all the posts, I'm going to go ahead and say array is array featured posts. I'm going to wrap that with an and so that I can move in my entire unordered list. And then inside, I can map through my featured posts. And for each post, pass through my unordered or my list item, where I can now specify my key, which can be the post slug, my post title, and it looks like we also need the date. So of course, because we're specifying our fields, I can now just simply say date created. And then for the date itself, I'm going to replace this with new date, pass in my post date created rather, and I'm going to use the toLocale string method, which is just easily going to set it up as a date format for me. And just like that, we now have all of our posts listed out on our homepage as our featured posts. But now we want to be able to link them somewhere. We want to be able to create our dynamic post links. Now to make this easier and save a little time, I already created a page that's just a simple static page that just shows some of this text that we're going to update, similar to what we did with the homepage. If we head over to that, it's going to be under the app directory, under post, and then under page, where we can see that it's just some static text. But what we're going to do, similar to the homepage, is we're going to request the post dynamically based on its slug so that we can get only the information about that specific post and then populate that page. Now, the important thing about this, though, is we want this to be a dynamic path. Currently, it's just a static path because we're currently going to /post/post. We want this to be the post slug that we dynamically get. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to rename, or rather name this post, depending on if you're adding a new page rather, and we're going to make this post slug, which because we're specifying those brackets, can't type here, because we specified those brackets, we're making it a dynamic value. So what's going to happen is this parameter is going to be passed into our component, which we're going to set up now. So we're going to specify brackets and then whatever we want to name this parameter. So inside of the post page itself, let's get rid of this sidebar for a second. This is going to be passed in as an argument into our post page component. So we're going to destructure this as our params, and then we can also type this out because we're going to get our params, which will then include our post slug, which is going to be that value that we set up inside of the file routing system. So now we're going to have the params. It's going to come in as our params object, and that post slug will be a string. So now if we try to console log this out, such as params, and then our post slug, we can see if we just leave this as is and we refresh the page inside of our terminal, we can see that we get this params post value. Now, if I change this to, for instance, hello world, and I go back to my terminal, we can see that the param now says hello world. So of course, what we can do now is we can request the data for that specific post. Now heading to the code, we're going to do something very similar to what we're doing with get posts, only it's going to be singular now. So let's go ahead and start off by cloning this function. I'm going to rename this to get post, and I'm going to say get post by slug because I like to specify the identifier that we're using. My shift key is stuck, the identifier that we're using to get that. Now we're going to need to also pass that in as an argument, that slug, because we want to get that singular value. So I'm going to pass in the first argument as my slug. And rather, we don't want that to be optional. We want that to be required because we need that to be able to make the actual request. So what I'm going to do now is, instead of read items, we want to read a singular item. So it's going to be read item. We're going to get rid of the S on that. I'm going to import that from the Directus SDK. We can see that it updated at the top. And now it's going to have a similar signature to read items, only instead of the second argument being our options, we're going to add our slug as that second option. So again, it looks very similar to read items, only instead of getting all the items and then passing the options, we're getting a slug from our items and then passing the options as our third argument. Now, one thing I realized is we never updated the get post to pass it as an array of post. What I'm going to actually do is, because of the way that this method is set up, I can now just specify that I want to return this as a promise of an array of my post object. And similarly for the get post by slug, instead of passing this as the unknown, I'm going to pass this as a promise with the post itself. Now, the good thing is, if we head back to our homepage real quick, we can see that we are getting those TypeScript errors now. We are getting that tape safety. Oops, we missed that before. So the only thing we're going to do is we're going to add the rest of that post data that we were missing, our date created. And if we head back to the homepage, we can see that we now just have that one error, is because it might potentially be undefined. That's because we just might only request certain data depending where we're at. So we just want to make sure that it is existing before we try to paste it into that date object. And it's still yelling at me. It looks like I forgot the D at the end of the actual type definition. Okay, but enough of the homepage. Let's actually start to populate our actual post page. Now, heading back to our dynamic route where we're grabbing this params post slug, let's start to actually query that data. So constant post is equal to await get post by slug, where we're going to pass in that post slug. We can now import that from our lib posts, and let's console log out our post data. And as expected, we have all of our information inside of the terminal. Now, of course, I want to only limit the data that we're getting because we don't need all that data, at least yet, in the UI that I have. So I'm going to specify my options with my fields, where that's going to be my title, my body, which is going to be a string, and I'm going to get my date created. So now starting to actually sub out all these values. First of all, my title will be post title. I'm going to update my date value to be the new date, which was going to pass in the post date created, which I'm going to similarly use the toLocale string method. We need to also make sure that that exists before we try to use it inside of that method. And then now that we get to the body, this is going to be a little bit more tricky. Now, if I console log out the body itself, we can have a little bit more definition into what we're going to see there. Where if we look inside the terminal, we can see that we actually get blocks as the data that we want to associate, where each of the blocks is going to represent the different paragraph or header or whatever it is that we're adding as a block inside of here, where we can see that the one block for hello world is going to be a type of paragraph. Now, to make this a little bit easier to read, I just added a JSON stringify here, and we can see exactly what this looks like. We have each of the blocks, so we're going to loop through each of these blocks, and then we're going to, depending on the data type, we're going to handle it a little bit differently. Now, starting off, let's make TypeScript happy. I'm going to go ahead and just paste this one in this time, where we have our body, and for each of our blocks, we're going to have an ID, a type, a data, and the text that actually goes in that blocks. If you have different data types, it might be a little bit different, but I just recommend adding that as you get it. But now let's actually loop through that data. So inside of this div where I want to actually show up my content, I'm going to first get rid of the existing data that's in there. I'm going to say post body blocks. And for each of these, for each block, we want to make sure that these blocks exist. So I'm going to, of course, wrap array is array, the body blocks, and I'm going to wrap that in. I can add some optional chaining here to make sure that the body actually exists. Probably only need that on the blocks. But then we want to also make sure that we start to add that data into the DOM. Now, because the way that this works is we don't know the type of data before we actually start to inspect it, what we can do is we can say if block type equals paragraph, then we're going to return a paragraph. So if block.type equals paragraph, I'm going to return my new paragraph, which I want to make sure that I include a key of block ID to make sure React is actually happy. But then I can add my block data text. Now, it's been a minute since we looked at our blog post page, so let's head over to the browser where we now see hello world. We have a dynamic date and time, which we probably don't need all that time there. We can modify that as we want. And then we have our dynamic text. Now, let's look at a little bit more of an advanced blog post here where we have our lint and format example. Let's now go to this post where we can see that we do have the dynamic data, but we're missing that header that we see inside of the block. Now, if we actually look at the inspected data for this one, we can see that we do have that paragraph. We have a bunch of paragraphs rather, but we also have this header, which is going to be a little bit more simplified. And we're also going to get the level here. So we have a type of header, we can get the text, and if we want, we can set up dynamic headers. So I'm going to go ahead and clone this return statement, and I'm going to say, or rather the entire if statement, and I'm going to say if the type equals header, I'm going to go ahead and make this an H2. We're going to keep the rest of it because it's pretty much going to be the same. And the only thing that I'm not going to do that you might want to do is you can probably dynamically create a component based off of the header level, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, you can dynamically create that so that you don't have to specify a manual if statement with a return for each and every one of these. You might also want to create a helper. Maybe you can publish that open source for other people to use. But we can see that as soon as I add that, we now have my header. Now, one thing that's different about the text that we're rendering on this page compared to the other pages is if we start to scroll down a little bit, we're actually using HTML as part of that. Now, because we're using the block editor, we have a richer experience for the different types of data that we can provide in there, and links are one of those. And we need a way to render this rather than just dumping the text as a pure string. So instead of adding the text as a child here, what we're going to actually do is we're going to use dangerously set inner HTML, which you generally shouldn't use unless you know that the source of that data is trusted. And because it's our own CMS, we know that it's going to be trusted, so we can use that here. Where what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut out this variable for a second here. I'm going to self-close my paragraph tag because what I'm going to do is I'm going to add dangerously set inner HTML, and it's named that way to be extra scary so that you're actually considering what you're doing before this. If you don't know the data source, maybe you can add a sanitize function. You can find some on NPM. Because I know what this is going to be again, I'm going to add HTML, which is double_HTML, where I'm going to set that value of data block text. Now I'm going to do the same thing with my header. Now, generally speaking, I think I just have that as a string, so we probably won't see this as the HTML, but if you do want to have a rich title, such as maybe you want to add a bold letter or word as part of that, this is a good way to do that. But now if we head back to the page, we can see that we do now have that link. And if we hit it, we can see the law of triviality. So that wraps up our home and our blog. What else might you want? You probably want some pages that you can create dynamically so that you can add whatever you want, such as maybe an about page or a courses page, or really whatever that could be. Now, again, because this isn't necessarily special compared to what we did with our homepage and our posts, I went ahead and skipped ahead where we have our pages now. I created a new schema that is really just the title and the body. And we have courses, which I also created, which includes a list of different courses that I can create. That includes a title, link, and the cover, which we'll show in a second here. Inside of the courses page, we can see that I added a couple courses here. Inside of our pages, I just added an about page and a private page for Cosmo. In the code, I basically just duplicated the post slug page where we can see we're getting the page by slug now, and we can grab this and paste in the same kind of thing that we did before. So if I go to the app and I go to the about page, we can see that I now have the about page, and it's working just the same. The only minor difference is we notice that I have this page slug at the root of the project. So if Next.js doesn't find another page, such as courses, which we'll see in a second, it's going to go to that dynamic parameter, that dynamic value that I can then use to look it up, just like we did for posts. But if we go to the courses page now, we can see that because it's a custom file, I can actually go directly to that rather than it going to that dynamic page. But the only thing that I want to do now is I want to be able to show this dynamically in different locations. Now we have our dynamic page routes, but how are people going to actually get to them? Now, one way is to have some kind of global navigation. Now, if we head to the header page, we can see that it's a pretty simple header. I just have my static my blog. I have a placeholder link. I even have the GitHub link here. But what we want to do is we now want to get those pages and we want to dump them into the navigation. So I'm going to say constant pages is equal to await get pages. I'm going to import that in from lib pages, and we can now start to use that to loop through. So let's log this out to see what it's going to look like. And if we refresh the page, we can of course see in the terminal that we have the slug, we have the title. And because we only need the slug in the title, we can now pass in our options like we did before. So we have our fields, which is going to be our title and our slug. But now let's actually loop through those. So inside of the navigation, I'm going to say I want all my pages, map for each page. I'm going to return this new list item, which will include my page.slug. I need to prefix that with the actual backslash there, or forward slash, and then I'm going to have my page dot title. Now, of course, we need to make a key, and because our slug is going to be dynamic, we can say page dot slug, which actually doesn't go on the link, it goes on that list item. And now we can see that we have our pages dynamically being added to the navigation. But we can see that if we click through those, oh, this was supposed to be a private page. Cosmo didn't want anybody to see this. So how can we actually make it so we only show the ones that we want to show in the navigation? One way that we can handle this is we can add an additional property to our pages to specify whether we want it to be a navigation item or not. So I'm going to create a new field, and I'm going to make this a drop down where I'm going to say, make this navigation. We can make it a type of string because we're going to say either yes or no. Then we can add our choices. So we either have our yes, which will be the actual text that showed, and the value will be yes. And then we have no, which will have a lowercase no for the actual value. Now for the default value, we can default it as no, and then we can save. So if we now go to our pages in the about, we do want our about page to be a navigation item. So let's hit yes. And we can see that if we go to Cosmo, that is not a navigation item. Now, if we refresh the page, we can see it's still showing, but now we can actually apply that filter. Now, in addition to these fields that we're passing through to filter in the data that we receive, we can also pass a filter based off of the data of that particular object. So we're going to pass in a new filter property, which again, this is going to go to the read items function. If we remember here, if we go to the lib pages, we're passing in these options to read items. So really what we're specifying here is this filter and the fields to the read items function. But we're going to define this inside of our helper function, of course, where it's going to be a new object. And we're going to specify that we want to target the navigation field where we want to say if it's equal to yes, that's the only time that we want to actually receive it. Now, of course, we need to type out this filter now. So if we head back to our pages, or rather we want to go to our items query, we want to make sure that we add this as a new option. So I'm just going to paste this in, but I'm setting this up as a record where we're going to have a string property. We have the equality check, which I'm sure there's other filters that you can apply as well, where we're going to specify either a string or a number, depending on the data type. And in our case, we're going to specify that we want that navigation to be yes. But now if we refresh the page, we can see that we only get that about link because the about link is the only one that has that actual yes associated with the navigation. Now, if you want to learn more about filtering as well as the plenty other options that you have available to pass in there, head over to the Directus docs where you can search for filter where you can land on this page based off of the queries. But now I think there's one other thing that I want to make sure that I update inside of the navigation is I want to make sure that the name of this site is actually dynamic. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new collection. This time I'm going to name it global, meaning this is going to be global data. And similar to the homepage, I'm going to treat this as a single object. Now this one can remain as an ID. That doesn't matter too much. So I'm going to click next and click through. Where for this particular data type, the thing that I'm most interested in is I want to name the site. So for this, I'm going to select an input and let's just call this title. This is going to be our site-wide title. I can hit save. I'm going to go ahead and add space jelly as my site-wide title. And after setting up the get global function, just like we did with get home for the homepage data, I can now specify my data, which is equal to await get global. I can make sure I import that in from libglobal, where now I'm going to be able to replace this static my blog with data title. And we can see that the site is now updated with that dynamic value. We can even do the same for the rest of the data. We can change the GitHub link based off of something inside the admin, or if we want to add some other static links, we can update the footer to make sure that that's a dynamic value. And I think the only other thing that I want to do here is when we have our different posts, we want to be able to post these in different types of categories. Maybe I have some tutorials, or maybe I have some news updates. I want to make sure that I am able to bucket these based off of what kind of post it actually is. So I'm going to create yet another data model, and I'm going to call this post categories. Where similar to what we did before, I want to make this a slug so that each of the categories have a slug. Just in case in the future I want to add a specific page for that category, we can check on all the typicals, even the created and the updated. And the only other thing that I want to make sure that I add is the title for each of these categories. Where if I start to add some items, maybe you have tutorials, or rather lowercase tutorials, and then maybe I have a separate one of news updates. Now, the one thing that we haven't explored here is how do we relate data between all the different types of data that we have, where in this case, we want to be able to associate certain posts with our categories. So if we head back to our settings and go to our data model, we're going to go to posts where we're going to create a new field. And this time we're going to search for many to many, where we're going to add a relational field, which is going to specify that relationship between the post and the category. Now, as far as the name, we can simply name this categories. If we scroll down, we can see that we now need to relate this to another collection, which is going to be that relationship that we talked about. So if I now select existing, we're going to select post categories because we want to specify that this is going to be our posts that relate to our specific categories. But now we can go ahead and save this, where we first need to save this. But another thing that we want to do is we want to head back into the settings. Once you have this saved, you can go ahead and click back into it to configure it. But because we now specified that relationship where we can see how it's actually going to be set up using a junction table, which we'll see in a second, we can actually start to go through the settings. And then one thing that's interesting is we can set up a display template. Now, by default, it's just going to show the ID based off of that post category, but we want it a little bit more descriptive. So if we click the plus here, we can now look at the post category slug, and we can say we want to show the title of the category that we're specifying, and maybe even show the slug along with it, just in case we want to see the exact slug that's associated with that particular title. But now let's hit save. But now if I head back into my actual content, go to my posts, and such as the lint and format one, if I now try to add an existing category, I can select tutorials, for instance, hit save, and we can see that it now popped up as a category. And similarly, if I save this and I go to the other ones, such as Hello World, I can go ahead and add my existing of news. I can go to my other one, which I just added as an example, updates and tutorials, just to show that, of course, we can add both categories if we choose to. Now, if we head back into our dynamic post page, let's start to try to query that data. Where the first thing I want to add categories, and then let's console log out our post. Now, if we start to look at the terminal, we'll actually notice that we don't get that data value back. Now, the issue is we need to also make sure that this is publicly accessible. It doesn't just inherit that. So in the access or public policy for the access, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I'm adding the post categories as well as the junction table. And I didn't cover that before. So let's add the read access for these. But what's actually happening behind the scenes is whenever we added that relationship, we can now see that we have this hidden junction table, which is going to associate both the category and the post together inside that one table. Now it's hidden because you're not intended to actually modify that yourself. It's going to happen automatically behind the scenes when you're actually looking at the database level. But now if we try to hard refresh the page again to get that new data source in, we can see the categories, only this time we only see that we get a number, which isn't exactly helpful in our case, because what this is actually giving is the ID of the junction table. So do we actually have to query the junction table, then the categories? Not quite. If we remember what we did for our image, what we can do is we can specify dot star, where the data that we actually get for the categories is we get the post slug itself, but we also get that category slug. So now we can interface directly and query directly for that category information. So I went ahead and created my categories lib file where I'm going to add my get category by slug. And as far as where I'm actually getting that data for my post, instead of getting everything for the category, I'm just going to get the or category slug. I'm then going to get my category slugs. So I'm going to say post categories, make sure that exists. And then for each of those values, I'm going to destructure my post category slug so that I just have a nice array of just those slugs to work with. Now we can see that we're getting some TypeScript issues here. First of all, we need to make sure that we actually add the categories to the post object. And then because this might not be an object, let's also add a filter here. So I'm going to say filter and make sure that the actual category is type of category equals object. And I don't think this likes it on a new line, so I'm going to go ahead and bump that back up. But we can see that makes TypeScript happy then. But now let's console log out these category slugs rather, just to see that we do have that data. So now we can see that for this particular post, it's only tutorials. So we only have that one tutorial. So what we can do now is actually loop through and get the data for all those categories. So we're going to say constant categories is equal to, we're going to make sure that the category slugs actually exist first. We're going to say await promise.all. And then for each of the category slugs, we're going to map through and create an async function. So for each of those slugs that we're going to get, we're going to ultimately return get category by slug, where we're going to pass in that slug value. So now the categories should have all the data about each and every one of those. Now it looks like I mixed up that get category by slug. I renamed the wrong one. So of course, because we want to use the read items versus read item, we want to make sure that this is going to be our slug, which will be a string. And I'm going to simply pass in that slug as that second value and import in our read items function. And finally, update the type to be just a singular instead of an array. But now we have our categories and it should show all of our data, including that title. So let's go ahead and try to loop that out. So instead of saying at the end here, our in post, let's say categories map through. And for each one, we want to grab the title, show that title inside the DOM. And then we also want to join through because if we have multiple, we want to make sure we join that so that it looks like it's a list of the categories. But now if we head back to the page, we can see that we now have our tutorials. If we try to go to one of our others, such as updates and tutorials, we can see that we have a list of the categories. Now we covered a lot here, but we were able to see how extensive this can be in really supporting all the data that we need for our project. But not only do you want your content to be good, you also want your branding to be good. So here's the right way to set up a fave icon.